The crew aboard the Hope had just received the most unnerving news. The alien fleet, a massive armada stretching across the stars, was moving towards Earth. The communications from the fleet were clear. They had no interest in negotiations or peace. Their mission was simple: eradicate humanity. Captain Darnell stood at the command console, his face grim but composed. He knew the odds. One warship against an entire alien fleet. The chances were slim, but there was no other choice. They had to fight. He glanced at his crew. Everyone was tense, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They were about to face something no one had ever imagined: a battle for the very survival of Earth. "We don't have much time," Darnell said, his voice steady, cutting through the growing tension in the room. "Prepare for impact. Stay focused." The ship's engines hummed as the crew scrambled to their stations. Systems were coming online, but the truth was, the Hope wasn't built to stand against a force this large. It was humanity's last-ditch effort, their only weapon, and its effectiveness was still a mystery. Lieutenant Sarah, the ship's weapons officer, glanced nervously at her console. "Captain, we got incoming fire. They're already targeting us." The alarms went off, sending a wave of panic through the crew. But Darnell stayed calm. He had to. "Brace for impact," he ordered, gripping the edge of his chair. The sound of energy beams hitting the hull rattled the ship. The entire ship trembled as if it were about to break apart. Sarah's eyes widened as the damage reports started coming in. Shields at 70%, hull integrity at 65%, and most concerning, the main reactor was unstable. "Damage report," Darnell barked. "We're holding together for now, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But if they keep this up, we'll lose power." The alien ships were closing in. The massive fleet was no longer just a distant threat. It was here, and it was here to destroy them. The view screen flickered as the enemy ships appeared in full view, massive, sleek, and powerful. The alien commanders looked down on humanity's lone ship, no doubt laughing at its small size, its outdated design. But what they didn't know was that the Hope carried a secret, a weapon that could level the playing field, if only they could get close enough to use it. "Now, Lieutenant," Darnell shouted, "fire the secondary weapons. Keep them back." Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the controls. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced herself to act. She launched a barrage of missiles towards the closest alien ship, but the enemy's advanced shields absorbed the impact with ease. The missiles did little more than scratch the surface of their vast armada. The crew watched in stunned silence as the alien ships remained unscathed, their firepower relentless. "It's not enough," Sarah muttered, frustration lining her voice. She looked back at the captain. "We need more power." Darnell felt a surge of anger but controlled it. "I know. Get the main weapon online. We have one shot at this." The crew rushed to activate the weapon, a last-ditch effort designed to turn the tide of battle. But it wasn't ready. The power requirements were enormous. The energy reserves were already low, and it would take every ounce of power the Hope had left to fire it. "Captain," shouted Ensign Evans, the tactical officer, "the alien flagship is targeting us. They're focusing all their firepower on us. They know we're the threat." Darnell's mind raced. This was their moment. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Sarah, fire the weapon," he commanded, desperation creeping into his voice. A tense silence filled the bridge as Sarah worked quickly to line up the shot. The energy core was unstable, but there was no time to waste. She flicked the switch, activating the weapon. The ship's systems groaned under the pressure as the weapon charged. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening. The crew watched in breathless anticipation, hearts pounding in their chests. Then, with a deafening roar, the weapon discharged. The blast that shot from the Hope's core was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It wasn't just light or energy. It was sheer power, a force of nature that tore through the vacuum of space. The beam cut across the vast distance between the Hope and the alien flagship, slamming into its shields with a shockwave that sent ripples through the surrounding ships. For a brief moment, everything went quiet. And then the alien flagship exploded. The crew stared at the view screen, their eyes wide with disbelief. The flagship, the heart of the entire alien fleet, had been annihilated in a single blow. The explosion sent shockwaves through the remaining ships, their formations breaking apart as their communications were disrupted. The remaining fleet scattered, panic spreading among their ranks. They had underestimated humanity, but the victory was short-lived. The Hope was still shaking, its systems barely holding together. The weapon had drained almost all of the ship's power, and the reactors were starting to fail. The crew was still reeling from what had just happened. They had done the impossible, destroyed the heart of the alien fleet, but they didn't have much left to fight with. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "We actually did it." Darnell stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of relief and disbelief. They had just destroyed the alien flagship, but there were still countless ships left in the fleet. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Get ready," Darnell said, his voice cold with determination. "They'll be back. We've given them a taste of what we can do, but this war is far from over." As the Hope drifted in the aftermath of the blast, the crew knew one thing for certain. The aliens had underestimated humanity, but they wouldn't make the same mistake again. The war was on, and the real fight had only just begun. The aftermath of the first strike left the crew of the Hope in stunned silence. The alien flagship, once a symbol of overwhelming power, was now nothing more than a cloud of debris. Yet the victory felt hollow. The alien fleet was still out there, and although they had just obliterated the command ship, the remaining ships weren't retreating. They weren't scared. They were regrouping. "We've done some damage," Captain Darnell muttered, standing at the command console, watching the screen flicker with incoming readings. "But it's far from over. We need to keep them on the back foot. Now's our chance to strike." Lieutenant Sarah's fingers hovered nervously over the weapons console, her face pale. "Captain, we're out of power. The weapon is still offline. We can't get another shot like that without full energy recovery. And it'll take hours." Darnell gritted his teeth. The Hope was battered. Its systems were failing, and the crew was already exhausted from the initial onslaught. They had barely survived the first wave, and the alien forces weren't going to just roll over. They would adapt. They always did. "How long before we can fire again?" Darnell asked, his voice clipped with tension. "At least 30 minutes, Sarah replied, her voice tight. "We've got to reroute power to the main reactors and reset the energy core. It's risky. If we push it too hard, the ship might not make it." The captain's eyes narrowed as he turned away from the console. His mind raced. He knew that the Hope couldn't last long in this condition. If the aliens regrouped and attacked with full force, they wouldn't stand a chance. They needed that weapon, the Hope's only true advantage, online and ready to fire again. But the clock was ticking. The alien fleet was still advancing, albeit in disarray. Some ships had broken off, presumably to regroup and take up defensive positions. Others were heading directly toward the Hope, clearly not willing to let the small human vessel out of their sight. The larger ships, with their massive guns and intimidating size, glided slowly through space, while smaller, faster ships darted like swarms of angry wasps, closing the gap. Darnell clenched his fists. "Get the Hope moving. We need to stay ahead of them. Don't let them get a clean shot." The crew scrambled to follow orders, but even as the engines pushed forward, it was clear that they were already too slow. The alien ships were faster, more maneuverable. They could cut through the void with terrifying precision, closing the distance in a matter of moments. "Captain, incoming fire," shouted Ensign Evans, the tactical officer, as the view screen blinked with warnings. Before Darnell could even respond, the Hope was hit. The ship bucked violently under the strike, alarms blaring and lights flickering. A series of explosions rippled through the lower decks. The crew struggled to hold their ground as the bridge shook. "Status report," Darnell demanded. "Shields are down to 40%, Captain," Sarah shouted, her voice panicked. "Hull integrity's holding, but just barely. We can't keep this up." "Focus on evasive maneuvers," Darnell ordered. "Keep them guessing. Do whatever you can to make sure we don't get hit again. I need more time." The ship weaved and dodged as best as it could, but the alien ships were relentless. The Hope was agile, but against such a large fleet, it was like a rabbit trying to outrun a pack of wolves. Darnell's mind was racing, desperate for a solution, but there wasn't much to work with. They had one shot left, one chance to end this before they were wiped out. "Cap, we can't outrun them," Evans yelled over the comms, his voice cracking with fear. "They're closing in fast." Darnell's eyes snapped to the tactical screen. There were too many ships. They were being surrounded. In a split second, Captain Darnell made the hardest decision of his life. "Sarah, we're going to risk it. Overload the energy core. Get the weapon ready to fire now." "Sir, we'll lose the ship," Sarah protested, wide-eyed. "We don't have enough time to recover properly. The core isn't stable. We don't have time for anything else." Darnell barked. "Do it, Lieutenant." Reluctantly, Sarah began the sequence to overload the core. Every system in the Hope groaned under the pressure as the ship's energy was diverted to the main weapon, while the reactor's power surged to dangerous levels. Sparks flew from the panels, and the ship rattled as it strained against the overload. "We're out of options, Cap," Sarah shouted, the tension in her voice palpable. "This is going to push us to the brink. If it doesn't work, we won't survive." Darnell turned to his crew, his voice steady, but with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. "Get ready. This is our final chance." As the core reached critical levels, the weapon began to charge. The air on the bridge was thick with tension. Time seemed to slow as the countdown on the screen ticked closer to zero. They had seconds left. The alien ships were only moments away from launching their next attack. "Firing in 3, 2, 1, Sarah whispered, almost as if she didn't believe it herself. The entire ship trembled, and for a brief moment, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. Then the weapon fired. The beam was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It wasn't a simple shot of energy. It was a colossal, blinding explosion of power, an unstoppable force that tore through space itself. The aliens had no time to react. The beam tore through their ships like paper. The first ship exploded, followed by a chain reaction that took out the next, and the next. In a matter of moments, the entire alien fleet was in chaos. Ships were torn apart, scattered to the wind like pieces of debris. Those that remained tried to flee, but it was too late. The damage was done. The fleet had been crippled. "Status report," Darnell shouted, barely able to hear himself over the ringing in his ears. "Captain, we did it," Sarah gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. "We destroyed them, all of them." Darnell let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking, but he remained standing, looking out at the wreckage of the alien fleet. The victory was incredible, but it was far from complete. The weapon had worked, but the Hope was barely holding together. The crew had survived, but the war was far from over. "We won this battle," Darnell said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "But don't think for a second that it's over. They'll regroup, they'll come back stronger, and next time, we'll be ready." As the wreckage of the alien fleet drifted in space, the crew of the Hope knew one thing for certain. Humanity had just sent a message to the stars, and it was a message the alien invaders would never forget. The victory that had seemed so certain moments ago now felt like a distant, fragile hope. The Hope floated in the midst of the broken alien fleet, debris scattering around them like shattered glass. The firestorm of destruction they had unleashed had been nothing short of miraculous. But Captain Darnell knew this was just a brief respite. The aliens were relentless, and they would return. They always did. The crew was exhausted. The bridge was eerily quiet after the chaos of the last battle. Sarah sat at her console, staring at the damaged systems with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had just wiped out the alien Armada, but the Hope was barely holding together. The ship was riddled with scorch marks. Hull integrity was at a dangerous low, and the energy reserves were all but depleted. There was no time to celebrate. Every moment spent here meant another moment the aliens could use to regroup, and the thought of that sent a shiver down Darnell's spine. "Captain," Ensign Evans said, his voice tense, "I've been trying to patch up communications, but it's going to take time. We can't call for reinforcements. Our signals are too weak." Darnell nodded grimly. "We're on our own for now, Evans, but we have a bigger problem." He looked out the view screen at the wreckage of the alien ships. Their once mighty fleet was now scattered and burning, but something felt wrong. There was no sign of the alien flagship's commanding officers. No sign of retreat, just a sudden, eerie stillness. "Captain, look," Sarah shouted from her station, her eyes wide in alarm. Darnell's heart skipped a beat. A massive, unknown ship had appeared in the distance, emerging from the edge of the wreckage. It was larger than anything they had seen before, far more massive than any of the alien vessels they had just destroyed. Its hull was sleek, almost organic in design, and it pulsed with an unnatural glow, as though the ship itself was alive. The sight sent a cold chill through the crew. "It's them," Darnell whispered under his breath. "The real threat." This wasn't some remnant of the fleet. This was their true command ship. The alien race had been hiding this weapon in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, it was here. "They weren't just after Earth," Darnell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were after us all along. The first wave. It was a distraction." The enormous alien ship powered up, and the ominous hum that filled the ship made the hairs on the back of the crew's necks stand up. The lights in the control room flickered as if the ship itself was reacting to the approaching threat. The Hope was too damaged to outrun it, too depleted to fight it off with conventional weapons. "Sarah, status on the main weapon?" Darnell asked, forcing himself to sound calm even as the terror clawed at him. I'm trying, Captain," Sarah responded, her fingers flying over the console, but the systems were slow to respond. The weapon that had saved them before wasn't ready. It had drained the ship's power to near nothing, and there was no guarantee it would be able to fire again. "I need at least an hour to get it back online." "We don't have an hour," Darnell said firmly. "We need to fight. We need to buy ourselves time for the weapon to charge." He turned to Ensign Evans. "Get our shields back up as best as you can. If they fire at us, we won't survive without them." Evans didn't hesitate. His hands were already moving, his face a mask of determination, as he worked to restore the ship's defenses. The alien ship loomed closer, its weapons systems coming online. "Captain, their weapons are charging," Sarah warned, her voice taut. "They're going to fire any second." Darnell clenched his fists. "Sarah, get us moving. We need to stay out of their firing line. We can't let them get a clean shot." The alien ship loomed ever closer. It was so massive that it seemed to fill the entire view screen. Its surface shimmered with energy, and its weapons, large, glowing energy cannons, were aiming straight at the Hope. The bridge crew could feel the ship's approach, as though the very air around them was being charged with the power of an impending storm. The Hope lurched forward, trying to escape the oncoming fire, but it was too slow. The alien ship fired. The blast came out of nowhere, faster than any of them could react. The entire ship was rocked by the force of the impact. The lights went out for a brief second, the emergency sirens blaring as the ship shuddered violently. The blast hit their shields first, but the energy was overwhelming. It tore through the weakened barriers and slammed into the hull, ripping open a hole in the side of the ship. Shields are down. Hull breach in Sector 5. Evans shouted, his voice panicked as alarms blared. The Hope was barely hanging on. "Get us out of here," Darnell shouted, gripping the armrests of his chair as the ship's damaged engines groaned under the strain. Evasive maneuvers, full speed ahead. But it was clear they were no match for the alien ship's firepower. Another blast came, this one striking near the reactor core, sending tremors throughout the ship. The power flickered again, and the lights dimmed. Sarah's voice was filled with desperation. "We don't have much longer, Captain. We need more time." Darnell's mind raced. He knew they couldn't keep taking these hits. The Hope was on the brink of collapse, but they couldn't surrender. Not now. "We're not giving up," Darnell said through gritted teeth. He turned to Sarah. "Keep the weapon online. No matter what happens, make sure we get one more shot." He looked back at the alien ship. It was relentless, its massive guns charging again. Another blast was coming, but Darnell had no choice. They had no time to escape, no time to hide. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was sharp, focused. "Get ready, Sarah. We're going to make this count." The countdown to their final chance had begun. As the alien ship fired again, the Hope jolted one final time. But this time, something was different. Something inside the ship hummed with power. The weapon was charging, just in time. The air on the bridge seemed to thicken with tension. Would it be enough? Could they survive this final attack? The alien ship loomed closer, its massive guns aimed directly at the Hope. "Firing now," Sarah shouted. With a deafening roar, the Hope's weapon released its energy. In that moment, everything seemed to stop. Time slowed as the beam shot across the vacuum of space, a blinding flash of power that tore through the darkness toward the alien ship. The enemy ship, so sure of its victory, had no time to react. The beam collided with the alien vessel with the force of a supernova. The shockwave sent ripples through the surrounding debris. The alien ship shuddered, its surface cracking open as the beam tore through it like a hot knife through butter. For a few seconds, the ship's structure held, then it exploded. The entire vessel erupted in a brilliant ball of fire, collapsing in on itself, taking everything with it. The remaining alien ships scattered in confusion. Their fleet was broken. In that moment, the Hope had struck a final, decisive blow. But the battle wasn't truly over. The war for humanity's survival had only just begun. The wreckage of the alien command ship floated in the vast emptiness of space, a testament to humanity's unexpected resilience. The Hope had done the impossible, destroying the alien flagship with a single powerful shot. Yet, as the crew stared at the devastation on their screens, there was no sense of victory. There was no time to relax, no moment to breathe easy. The fight was far from over. Captain Darnell's voice rang out through the tense silence on the bridge. "Report." Ensign Evans, still shaken from the barrage of explosions and the near destruction of their own ship, was the first to answer. "The alien fleet is disorganized, Captain. Most of the ships are either fleeing or drifting aimlessly, but some of them are regrouping. It won't be long before they reorganize, and when they do, they'll come back at us with full force." Darnell's heart pounded in his chest. He had hoped that the destruction of the flagship would cause the rest of the fleet to retreat, but the aliens were far more calculating than that. This wasn't a surrender. This was a pause. They would be back, and they would be angry. "We need to use this time wisely," Darnell said, his voice calm but resolute. "Evans, keep monitoring their movements. Let us know the moment they start to regroup." "Sarah," he turned to his weapons officer, who was still looking at the console with wide, exhausted eyes. "Get the main weapon online. I don't care how you do it, just make it work. We need another shot." "I'll do my best, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice strained. She didn't sound confident, but she had no choice but to try. The damage to the ship was severe. The core was unstable, and the last energy discharge had drained nearly all of their power. The weapon would take hours to recharge properly, and they didn't have that long. "Keep pushing," Darnell urged, though he knew it would be difficult. Their ship wasn't built for prolonged warfare. The Hope had never been meant to fight an entire fleet, let alone one with such advanced technology. The crew had already defied the odds once, but there were still many more enemies to face. "We're not going to win this with just one shot," Darnell muttered, his mind racing. He looked out of the view screen at the wreckage of the alien fleet, knowing that the aliens weren't going to just give up. "We need a strategy. We need a way to make them pay for what they did." There was a brief silence as the crew absorbed the weight of his words. They had destroyed the heart of the alien fleet, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Darnell's eyes drifted across the room, catching the tired faces of his crew. He could see it in their eyes. Doubt, fear, exhaustion. He couldn't let them fall apart now. Not when Earth's fate still hung in the balance. "Get to work, people," Darnell said, his voice firm and authoritative. "We don't have much time. We've bought ourselves a moment, but they won't let us off the hook for long." The crew moved quickly, each person returning to their station, determined to make the best of the grim situation. But as the ship began to limp away from the wreckage, the tension was thick in the air. It was clear that they were just waiting for the next round of destruction. Meanwhile, the Hope's sensors detected movement. The alien ships were regrouping. The smaller vessels had begun to circle back, reorganizing themselves and preparing for their final assault. But it wasn't just the ships they had to worry about. The flagship wasn't just a command ship, it was a mobile weapons platform. And somewhere inside that destroyed wreckage, the alien commanders were likely preparing to launch an even more devastating offensive. Captain Darnell turned to Sarah, who had been trying to stabilize the weapon systems. "How long until the weapon is fully charged?" "At least another 2 hours," Sarah replied, though the strain in her voice was evident. "And that's if everything goes perfectly." Darnell knew that wasn't an option. They couldn't afford to wait 2 hours. The alien fleet would be ready long before that. Their only chance to strike again would be while the enemy was still disorganized. "We don't have 2 hours," Darnell said, thinking quickly. "Sarah, I need you to power up the secondary systems. We'll use everything we have left to buy us more time." "What about the main weapon?" Sarah asked, looking worried. "If we push the core too hard." "We don't have a choice," Darnell interrupted. "We'll make it work." The crew worked in near silence, knowing how risky this was. The tension on the bridge grew as the seconds ticked by. With every moment, the alien fleet grew stronger, more organized. The Hope was a sitting target, vulnerable without its main weapon online. But Darnell had no choice. They needed to take a risk. If they didn't, the aliens would finish what they started, and humanity's last hope would be gone. Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the ship, its shrill sound cutting through the tense air. Evan's voice was shaky, but urgent as he called out, "Captain, incoming." "They're coming right for us." Darnell's heart raced. The alien fleet had regrouped far faster than he had anticipated. They were closing in fast. He turned to Sarah, his eyes sharp. "Is the secondary system ready?" "Almost," Sarah said, her fingers a blur as she worked the controls. "Just give me a few more." "Do it now," Darnell barked. "We can't afford to wait." With a deep breath, Sarah hit the final command. The ship groaned, and the secondary systems came online with a jolt. The power surge was intense, and for a moment, it seemed like the Hope might shake apart from the strain. But it held. Barely. "Firing sequence ready," Sarah reported, her face flushed with the effort. "It's not as powerful as the main weapon, but it'll have to do." "Fire," Darnell commanded. The ship's guns roared to life, unleashing a hailstorm of energy blasts at the approaching enemy vessels. The alien ships attempted to dodge, but the blasts were fast, relentless. The Hope's fire tore into the smaller ships first, knocking out shields and systems in quick succession. But it wasn't enough to stop the larger vessels, those that had survived the initial chaos. They were closing in, their weapons aimed at the Hope. Another blast rocked the ship, knocking the crew off their feet. The lights flickered, and alarms blared again, but Darnell refused to give up. He grabbed the armrests of his seat, steadying himself as the crew scrambled to maintain control. "We can't keep this up," Sarah gasped. "We're out of options." Darnell looked at the view screen, watching as the alien ships closed in, preparing for their final assault. His mind raced. There had to be something he was missing. They couldn't win this battle without more power, without that main weapon. And they didn't have 2 hours. But then, something caught his eye. Among the alien ships, there was a pattern, a weakness. The alien ships were powerful, but their coordination wasn't perfect. They were still reeling from the destruction of their flagship, and the smaller vessels weren't able to keep up with the larger ones. If he could draw them into a trap. "Sarah," Darnell said, his voice suddenly sharp with clarity. "Can you adjust the targeting systems? I have an idea." She nodded, still looking overwhelmed. "What do you have in mind, Captain?" "I'll give them a target they can't resist. We're going to use their own strategy against them." The tension on the bridge was unbearable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The sound of the crew's hurried movements filling the air as they tried to keep the Hope from falling apart. The alien fleet was closing in fast, but Captain Darnell had a plan, an audacious one, but it was all they had left. "Evans," Darnell said, his eyes fixed on the screen showing the approaching alien ships, "I need you to simulate a weak spot. I want the alien ships to think we're more vulnerable than we are. Can you make it look like we're on the verge of total shutdown?" Evans blinked in surprise, unsure of what the captain meant, but he didn't hesitate. "You want us to fake it? Make it look like we're on the edge of collapse." "Exactly," Darnell replied. "Give them an easy target. Make them think they've got us cornered. When they take the bait, we'll spring the trap." A murmur of disbelief ran through the crew. It was a high-risk strategy, and if the aliens figured out they were being played, it would be over for them. But Darnell knew that was the only option left. They had no time to rebuild their power, no time to wait for the main weapon to charge back up fully. This was their chance. "Sarah, how much longer until the secondary systems are ready to fire again?" Darnell asked. Sarah's fingers flew over the console. "I can get a few more shots out of it, but we're running out of power. It'll be a matter of minutes before we completely drain the systems. If we don't take action soon, we'll be defenseless." "Make it work," Darnell ordered, his voice cold but determined. "We're drawing them in. When they strike, we hit them with everything we've got." Evans didn't waste another second. He began feeding fake data into the Hope's communication systems, simulating a total systems failure. Power levels dropped on the redouts, and the ship's movement slowed, mimicking the signs of a dying vessel. They needed to appear as weak as possible. Lucky for them, the Hope was already battered beyond recognition. "Good. Now let's get their attention," Darnell muttered under his breath. The alien ships were still closing in, their weapons powering up. Darnell watched them on the screen, silently praying the ruse would work. The alien fleet was slow to react at first. But then, as they got closer and the readings showed the Hope's crippled state, they began to tighten their formation, preparing for the final kill. Darnell's breath caught in his throat as the lead alien ship fired. A blast of deadly energy came from one of their larger vessels, streaking across space, its target obvious. The Hope, or what appeared to be the Hope, was the perfect prey. "Here they come," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but tense as she saw the alien ships lining up for their shot. Darnell's eyes never left the screen. He could feel the crew's collective anxiety growing, but there was no turning back now. "Braced for impact," he shouted. The blast hit, sending the ship jolting violently. The hull rattled, and alarm screamed as the Hope's shields gave way to the force of the energy beam. The ship shuddered from the impact, but Darnell could see on the damage control readout that it wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. The shields had absorbed most of the blast, leaving the ship vulnerable but still operational. Now, Darnell roared. In an instant, the crew sprang into action. Sarah slammed her hands on the weapons console, triggering the secondary system's energy blasts. The guns on the Hope erupted with a barrage of fire, sending concentrated blasts of energy back toward the alien fleet. The first few shots were wild, but they hit their marks, striking the smaller alien vessels that had been closing in for the kill. The plan was working, but Darnell knew this wasn't enough. They had to hit harder, and they had to do it now before the aliens realized they'd been tricked. He turned to Sarah. Sarah nodded, her finger hovering over the fire button. There was a moment of complete silence, an agonizing pause. And then, with a roar that shook the very core of the Hope, the main weapon fired. The beam shot out of the ship, a massive concentrated blast of energy that tore through space, faster than the speed of light. It cut through the alien fleet with terrifying precision, slamming into the largest alien vessel. The explosion was cataclysmic. A shockwave sent ripples through the surrounding ships, and debris from the destroyed flagship scattered in every direction. The remaining alien ships scrambled to evade the blast, but it was too late. The beam didn't stop with the flagship. It tore through the fleet, ripping apart the smaller ships in its wake. In an instant, the once unified alien armada was in disarray, many of their ships disintegrating in flames or retreating in panic. Darnell watched in stunned silence as the last of the alien ships burned in space, their once pristine hulls now shattered and smoldering. The bridge erupted into cheers. The crew couldn't believe it. Against all odds, they had done it. The aliens, once so sure of their victory, had been broken. The Hope had delivered the decisive blow. But as Darnell looked out at the wreckage of the alien fleet, he knew this victory was only temporary. The aliens would return. They always did. But for now, humanity had won a momentary respite. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "We really did it." Darnell nodded, his eyes scanning the remains of the alien fleet. There was no time for celebration. Not yet. They had won today, but tomorrow, the war would continue. "For Earth," he said quietly, "and for humanity, we'll fight again. And next time, we'll be ready." The crew nodded in agreement. The war was far from over, but for now, they had proven humanity's strength. Against all odds, they had turned the tide. And in that moment, Captain Darnell knew that no matter what came next, humanity would never surrender. Evans was already scanning the alien fleet on his console, his fingers dancing over the controls. "They're coming in fast, Captain, but I can try to make them think we're a bigger threat than we are. If I can spoof their sensors and feed them false data, it might cause them to hesitate for just long enough." "That's all we need," Darnell replied, his voice tight with urgency. "Do it." Evans worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "I'm setting up false readings to make it look like we've still got operational weapons on standby. If we can make them second-guess their attack, we might be able to buy enough time for the main weapon to come online." Darnell nodded, though he knew the danger. The alien fleet was smart. If they caught on to the deception, they'd overwhelm the Hope in seconds. But they didn't have the luxury of thinking things through. Time was slipping away. The bridge fell silent, save for the soft hum of the ship's systems and the occasional beeping of alarms. The crew watched as Evans worked feverishly to maintain the illusion of strength. It was their only hope. "They're slowing down," Evans said, his voice tight with relief. "I think it's working." "They're confused, Captain. Some of the smaller ships are pulling back." Darnell's eyes flicked to the screen, watching as the alien fleet began to form a defensive perimeter around the remaining larger vessels. The smaller ships were retreating, likely to regroup and rearm. But the larger ships, those were the real threat, and they weren't backing down. "We can't stop them forever," Sarah warned, her voice trembling with exhaustion. We need that main weapon. I know, Darnell said. But right now, we've bought ourselves a window. We'll make it count. He turned to the crew, his voice steady but commanding. Evans, keep feeding them false data. We need to keep them on the back foot. Sarah, I don't care what it takes. Get that weapon ready. The crew nodded in unison, pushing their already strained systems to the limit. Darnell's mind raced as he watched the alien ships. Every second counted. The Hope might be battered and weakened, but they had something the aliens didn't, the element of surprise. And Darnell intended to use it. As the alien ships hesitated, seemingly unsure of how to proceed, Darnell saw the faintest glimmer of hope. The larger ships were positioning themselves, likely preparing for a final assault, but they were still far enough away for the Hope to make one more move. The clock was ticking down, but they had a chance. Captain, Sarah said, her voice now filled with barely contained urgency, I can charge the weapon faster if we divert all non-essential power to the core. Do it, Darnell said, his mind already anticipating the consequences. Diverting all power to the main weapon would leave the Hope even more vulnerable, but it was their only shot at surviving the next wave. The ship trembled as the power transfer began. The lights flickered briefly, and the hum of the engines grew louder as the main weapon's core came online. Darnell could feel the tension building in the air, the sense that everything was on the line. We've got one shot at this, Sarah said, her hands flying over the controls. If we don't take them out now, we won't have another chance. Darnell's mind flashed back to the battle they had already fought, the destruction of the flagship, the way the aliens had underestimated them at every turn. But now, the aliens weren't underestimating them anymore. They knew the Hope was dangerous. They knew humanity was capable of things they hadn't anticipated. It was their final play, and there was no room for error. They're closing in, Evans said, his voice a mixture of fear and awe. The alien ships were within striking distance now. Their weapons were fully charged, their intentions clear. We're ready, Sarah said, her voice tense but resolute. Darnell stood tall, his eyes locked on the screen as the alien ships came into focus. There was no turning back now. If they were going to survive, they had to destroy the alien ships with everything they had left. He turned to Sarah. Fire when ready.